In the last lecture, we had learned about what happens when you submit your application to the Spark cluster. And we also learned about how the driver and the executors running in the containers on the cluster. Okay. Anyways, most of the Spark development happens on a local machine or using an interactive tool such as Spark Shell and I mean notebook or Spark Shell. So we still have two questions regarding this, like how Spark runs your application on a local machine when we do not have a cluster and a cluster manager. Okay, this is about the first question. And the next question is about how Spark runs our application when we use interactive tools, because in that case we don't submit the application to the Spark cluster. Okay, this lecture is going to answer both of these questions. Okay, let's start with the first question now. This is the first question: how you can run a Spark application on a local machine. Okay, you can execute a Spark application on your local machine without even having a real cluster, and we have already done these things in the earlier video. So these are the different types of cluster managers. Here you can see local and Kubernetes, Mesos and standalone. These are the cluster managers. You can configure your application. That means whatever the application you are going to run, you can configure that application to run on this following clusters. And the Spark engine is compatible with all of these cluster managers. Okay. So here I'm going to discuss about only the local, because our question is about how to run a Spark on a local machine. Okay, we will learn about all these remaining things in the upcoming videos. So coming to this diagram, when you configure your application to run with a single local thread in the sense here driver is the single local thread, then you will have a driver only, right? And no executors. In that case, what the driver will do? Your driver will be forced to do everything itself. Nothing happens in the parallel. Okay. However, when you run your application with 3 local threads, then your application will have one dedicated thread for the driver. Here you can see this is the driver. There will be a thread for this driver and 2 executor threads will be there. Okay, this local cluster manager, whatever it is there, this is the local cluster manager, right? So this local cluster manager is designed for running, okay, running your application and testing your application and debugging your Spark application, whatever it is. Okay, so it will be useful for running, testing, debugging of your Spark applications locally. So this technique is nothing but a simulation of distributed client server architecture. What do you say? Distributed client server architecture. Okay, here we are using how many threads? 3 threads. Okay, so multiple threads are we are using, so we can test our application locally. So let's go to the next question. The next question is, how does the Spark runs with an interactive tool? So we are going into it. Let's go. So the Spark gives you a choice to run your application in one of the following modes. There are 2 modes. One is client mode and the another one is cluster mode, right? So the client mode is designed for interactive clients such as Spark Shell and the notebooks, as we have already discussed these things. Spark Shell and notebooks, or they are in the client modes, which is an interactive mode. Okay. So in this client mode, here you can see this is the client machine, which is consisting of driver, and this is the cluster manager, which is consisting of executors. Executors are nothing but slaves here. You can see earlier we have already discussed the client server architecture, the master slave architecture. Okay, so coming to this, in this client mode, the Spark driver In this mode, the Spark driver process runs locally at your client machine. Okay, that means, however, the driver still connects to the cluster manager. Okay, and starts all the executors on the cluster. Here, starting all the executors in the sense starting all the slaves on the cluster. This is a this is a powerful feature for submitting interactive queries and receiving the results back to your client. Okay, so we are submitting a queries and we are receiving the results back to the client machine. Okay, that's how your Spark Shell and the notebook are working. And however, if you are quitting your client or you are logging out of your client machine, then your driver dies. Your driver is going to die. In which case, if you are quitting your client or if you are logging out of your client machine, and hence the executor will also dies in the absence of the driver. You know, right? The executor only will created by the driver, so the executors also will die if once the driver dies. Okay, so the client mode is suitable for interactive work but not for the long running jobs. So this is like an interactive session, right? I mean, you are requesting for a query and the result is sending back to the client machine. So this is how this client mode will work. That means we can't run long term jobs, because once the driver dies, the executors will also stop the work. I mean, it is also going to die. Okay, to avoid these things, we are going with another mode. Okay, that is called cluster mode. Now let's go to cluster mode. So now we are discussing about the cluster mode, right? So here in this cluster mode, the driver and the executors both are existing in the cluster itself. I mean, they are managed under the cluster manager. But in the previous client mode, the driver was there with the client side, okay, client machine. So that's why when the client is signed off, the driver is also going to die. That's why it became a short time running cluster, right, running application. But now in this case, this will become a long term running application. How I will tell here. The cluster mode is designed for submitting your application to the cluster and let it run here. In this mode, everything runs on the cluster. Your driver and the executors both will be here. Once you submit your application to run in cluster mode, you can log off from the client machine and your driver is not impacted because it is running on the cluster. So the cluster mode is made for submitting long running jobs to the cluster. Hope you understand the difference. Okay, we have some idea, right? Like how does the Spark run with an interactive tools? Like last we discussed the client mode and the cluster mode, and earlier we have already discussed how the Spark application will run on the local machine. Okay, we cleared these two questions, and if you have any questions, you can comment it, and we will discuss the remaining topics in the upcoming videos. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.